Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Policy Exchange. I'm Chris Yu. I'm head of the digital government team here at Policy Exchange, and I lead our work on technology, data, and the internet. And I'm delighted this evening that we're welcoming Conrad Wolfram to talk to us. Conrad is strategic director at the Wolfram Group. Wolfram Group created Mathematica, which some of you may have used, the Wolfram Alpha search engine, which again some of you may have used, and Conrad is also the founder of the computer-based math movement. Now, the discussion this evening is going to be about computation, knowledge, data, and information. You will know as well as me that the world is absolutely swimming in data these days. Here at Policy Exchange, we've done a lot of work on the implications for the public sector, the open data debate, the debate about using big data and analytics in government. And of course, these conversations about data are actually cut to our day-to-day lives as well. Actually, many of the services that we use generate enormous trails of data about us, and actually the companies that provide these goods and services rely on the data to build the products. The big question which Conrad is going to tackle is how we make sense of data and information in this world, and in particular the role that computation has to play, right, in translating lots of data and information into something which is meaningful to you, personal, tailored, and insightful. And you know what that means not just for governments and for business, but much more widely in terms of education and issues for our society as a whole. So before I hand over to Conrad, just a couple of things on housekeeping. We've got guest Wi-Fi in the room. The code is up on the walls. And if you've got your smartphone or your tablet and you want to tweet about the event, then the hashtag for this evening is Wolfram. Okay, so without any further ado, I will hand over to Conrad.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. It's nice to be here, and it's good to talk about a topic that is very central, I think, and will increasingly become so over the next decades. And the topic where it's, in a sense, cutting a new swathe across government, private sector, and education, and the way that we should form society around knowledge in the future. So I'm going to try and tackle this rather broad swathe, and I'd like to start by talking about a little bit of history, just to remind ourselves that there was a time not very long ago when there wasn't an overflow of data to everyone. It's actually surprisingly recent, but you know, one has to remind oneself that the big problem, perhaps 20 years ago, was it was hard to get information. The base information was kind of locked down and hard to get. I think we're now in a position where most people would claim they had huge data overload or knowledge overload. And the real question is how we go forward from that and move into sort of the next scenario. Now, the thing I want to say before that, though, is things are going to get much hotter yet in terms of the amount of overload. I mean, if you think about all the personal information that you're gathering, when you've sent emails, when you've gone onto Facebook, when you've done things, all the personal analytics that are going to be around that. Then there's all the health data that will increasingly be being collected. So you ain't seen anything yet in terms of the massive data overload we're going to see, both centrally and from each of us as individuals. So let's just talk about two aspects that have bedeviled us, I think, so far and caused this sort of data overload. One of the ideas and things that has happened a lot in the last few years, which is very positive, is that we've made data centrally, data that was often locked down before, we've made available. But the big question now is, how do we turn available to accessible? People thought these were quite close. If you just threw it out there and it was available, somehow it would become accessible. But in fact, that gap, as I'll argue, is quite a lot bigger than you might think. And that's something we have to address. Next question, how do we get from sort of averaged to personalized? What I care about are actual answers for me. In the end, that's what we're driving at. We need answers, and we need decisions. And the question is, how do you get from sort of averaged, data that you might find to data that's very specific to something you want? And those are two things that I think we can address as we move forward. Now, the big thing I believe we can do here is to have computation for everyone. And why do I believe this is such a big deal? What I really want to do in this talk is explain why computation for everyone is sort of key to achieving these two objectives of accessible data and personalized data. In the end, there's a simple purpose to all of this: better decisions, better answers and better decisions. And the key to this, I think, is giving people individually the sort of power to analyze their own information. So when you get data at the moment, the key thing you get is the data is usually, or the knowledge is set up for human readability. You are expected to take this knowledge as a human and work with it directly. And if you're lucky, throw it into something and help move it in a spreadsheet or whatever. But it's made so that you can look at it often. In the future, it should be made for citizen computation. So the idea should be that you have automation with you as the citizen. So the data doesn't have to be made for you to read it directly. You can get your automation to help you to get the actual answers you want. And by doing that, we open up a huge amount of possibilities. So really, the future is sort of citizen data access, in a sense, goes to citizen analysis. It's not just that the producer poses the actual questions and locks down what you're going to look at. It's that you can ask any of the questions you might want to ask and use the data to produce answers. You're generating the knowledge, in a sense. So I suppose my message here is we want to empower the knowledge consumer to generate the knowledge, instead of the person who produces the data or some intermediary generator. You yourself want to personally be able to generate that knowledge from the big sea of data that's out there. And that hasn't really been possible to a large extent so far. So let me show you some examples of accessing data in this sort of way. And these are fairly simple, and these are typical things that one might do. So let me maybe take something like how many sheep are there in the UK versus cows, let's say, versus people in UK. And let's see whether we can actually get that. Okay, here we go. So what's happened there is we actually computed an answer live. The data was in there, it was sitting in there, but we went and computed some answer live. And the good news is, ever since, well, I suppose since around the time this government came, there were more people than sheep. So according to this data. So anyway, we've made some progress there. And there seems to be some very weird data around sheep, which I haven't got into. And there are far fewer cows. So anyway, that's just a very simple, I'm pulling a computation, I'm typing something in linguistically, and I'm kind of doing a quick kind of thing like that. Well, let's try something else. Let's try, on this sort of theme, what's the fat in 100 grams of beef versus 100 grams of horse meat? Let's see whether we can see how healthy each of these really might be, at least by this measure of it. And hopefully if, let's see, the horse meat is gathering pace, I think, here. Okay, so it claims that, in fact, horse is significantly less fatty than beef, 6.1 grams instead of 13. So maybe the current problems are not as bad as we think. Let me show you a slightly different kind of thing, just to set the scene on more sort of a personalized type of thing. So, what's the life expectancy of, let's say, a 42-year-old, that would be me, male? And again, what this is doing is a slightly more customized, personalized thing to do with me. I'm 42, and I'm male, and the question is, what's my life expectancy? Not, let's do a search for general things. And so here we go. It's my chance of living past 50 is pretty good. My chance of dying before 100 is also pretty good. There are various ways you could look at this. But my point is, what we did there is a computation that's specific in some sense to me. And I suppose I'll give, you can start to do things like, well, too drunk. Let's see whether I can get something like this to work. Too drunk to drive after 2 glasses of wine. Let's say we're, I don't know whether I'll manage to pull this off, 180 pounds. That's kind of pushing it a little bit in terms of linguistics. But let's see whether we can pull something like that. There we go. So this is assuming that the time is an hour later, and here's where I am, and here's the spot of where I am. So now this is US data, I have to say. So under US driving rules, I'm probably okay if that's what I've done. But anyway, that's, again, a slightly more personalized thing. And then there's sort of mashing up amusing things like, you know, how old was David Cameron? Let's say this is more general data when, let's say, Nick Clegg was born, and see whether we can pull things like that off. So the point I'm trying to show you is you can type in things, and it's actually they're very close, at least in age. So surprisingly so. So anyway, those are examples of what I would call linguistic queries. We're typing something in. It's not going off and searching. It's going off and actually computing an answer. Now, I just want to show you one sort of furtherance of that, which is what you can do when you have linguistics with hopefully a phone. So you can ask something like, you can actually do voice, crime in New York versus Chicago. And as they say, Siri willing, let's see if we can try and pull this up. And I've got the video here to try and put the phone in front of the video, so I just about see this. But you can see that just from my utterance of voice, you can get a nice chart in that case of Chicago versus New York. So the point I'm trying to show is the interface, the look at this, is very important to whether I actually do it and whether the data is truly accessible. And I just want to make clear what I'm doing here. I'm trying to get answers. I'm not searching other people's answers. So there's a difference here. And one simplistic way to think about this is that knowledge is sort of a combination of facts, method, and interpretation. And what search is doing is it's kind of the computer is pulling the facts, and you're left with the method and interpretation. What we're trying to do with computational knowledge is get the computer to apply the method for you, which means the facts can be in a much more computer-rich form and much richer altogether. So here's another look at computable data and using computation to understand the world. So this is what I call a knowledge app. And so what we've got here is, this is what happens if you invested £10,000 in the stock market and you decided that when Labour were in power, you'd leave it in the red case, and you'd take it out the moment the Conservatives got in, and vice versa for the blue case. And how well does your £10,000 do later on? It's a very simplistic model, but just for amusement. Now, so there are two sliders I have. One is when exactly did you invest it, and that makes quite a difference. And the other one is how long do you think policy decisions take to have effect? Right? So if you think it's 0, the moment they come in, then that's the correct position for the slide. But if you start moving this rather changes the outlook. If you think it takes 6 years or so, that's where I am at the moment. So the point here is I've got an app that is, in a sense, allows me to analyze the computable data, the data myself. It allows me to do this. It's kind of like a narrative that I've got, but it allows me to query that narrative. So this is, in a sense, part of what I would call computable documents. And computable documents are a sort of fuller form of this narrative. They look like a normal document, but hey, here's in this case, it was a plea to the Texas government not to buy hurricane insurance. And you can actually start playing with the model in real time. This is how you make much better decisions. You actually argue about where the sliders are to make the decision, rather than just having a binary decision-making process. So that's a sort of typical example of using computation in a sort of narrative form. The key, which has been missed often in opening up data and making it accessible, not just available, is the interface. What exactly is it that you want to do with the computer, and what answer do you want to get out, in what form? And so I always start from that point of view. And what I've shown you is, in a sense, two extremes. Linguistic is what I would call drive-by. You're trying to just ask a quick utterance. You just quickly want to know the answer to something. And sort of narrative is the opposite end. You want to be led through something, but you want to be able to query it and kind of drive in the middle of that. And it's kind of like, it's like the difference between sort of open government and journalists, drive by sort of way of looking at things. One thing I also want to make clear, apps are not the only interface. People have got obsessed with apps, and apps are a very useful interface if what you want to do is a similar kind of thing every day. You want to use the data, but you want to do it in a kind of, you want to, let's say, look up, prices. You're an architect, and you want to look up particular things about buildings every single day. Apps are great. But if what you want to do is one day you want to look about schools, and the next day you want to look about health, and the next day you want to look about food, that's not the right interface for that setup. So one needs to think wider, and in that case I think linguistics is often very useful. So those are sort of elements of that. What are the, in a sense, technical ingredients that you need to democratize computation? So I've talked about how computation can take the available to the accessible. But what are the things underneath that are required? Well, automation is one. You've got to automate. You've got to build up many layers of automation. Think of computers. Years ago, computers were very hard to work because there weren't very many layers of automation. You kind of had to program the actual bottom layer of the computer. We're a bit like that with data right now. It's kind of like you can make stuff work, but you've got to hang it all together yourself. Where we need to be is sort of the much fancier, whether it's Mac or Windows interface or whatever that you have now, or the smartphone, where in fact there are huge numbers of layers of automation that have allowed us to have a workflow that doesn't require us to know exactly what the chip is doing in the computer. And that's the kind of difference that we need in terms of layers of automation. Obviously, you need computational power to pull these things off, and you also need knowledge that's computable. So this is a place where one needs to build some infrastructure. You need knowledge that you can actually work out answers from with a computer, not knowledge where you've got to pull strings together. And we have to go further than semantic knowledge to make that work, to what we call computable knowledge. And of course, I mentioned the interface. And I'd like to show you one other aspect of interface, which is building the apps or the examples of interactive apps that I showed. One of the things that has bedeviled interactivity in documents has been how easy is it to build the interactivity. Well, we're not there yet, but I thought I would give you now, and this partly shows that we're not there yet, because I'm going to show you an example. It's not highly relevant, because that's the best I can do with a sort of linguistic utterance to build this. But what I want to show you is taking linguistics and making it into an app in one go. But I'm going to pick an example which is basically a bit of math, and rather than picking a data example, which is what I'd really like to be able to do, but we're not quite there yet. So if I say something like interactive sine x, y, t, for example, we will, no, I don't want to do that. Let's see if we can make this work. Hopefully we'll go off and we will actually build a mini, very simple app here, which will, there we go, write a piece of code for me and build some piece of maths, in this case a function, to look at some analysis of this function. Now, I'd like to be able to do that with data. I'd like to be able to type in something with data where I can say, immediately show me something interactive and build me a little app for me to use repeatedly. Not there yet. But you can see where we're going here. What we've done here is kind of interesting. We've taken a linguistic drive-by query. We've turned it into a piece of code that you might have written yourself if you wanted to write code. And we've ended up with something that's pretty much like a mini app, all in a few seconds. That's where we need to go in order to make interactivity as part of sort of documents and everyday knowledge be as everyday as it should be. So I wanted to turn to what I call the value chain of, in a sense, the value chain of knowledge coming up. So one of the things that I believe will happen as we move forward with making data computable and giving citizens the sort of analysis that to be able to use that data straight off, is that what becomes valuable will change. And we've already seen some of this. If you've got dead data that you can't work with, it becomes very less valuable. The base data becomes less valuable. The ability to be able to analyze the data and put that automation in the hands of citizens becomes more valuable. And so the sort of value chain of knowledge is going to change quite a bit. And, you know, you've seen this a little bit with newspapers and things like that, where, you know, frankly, people aren't prepared to pay very much for the base information. What they want is stuff they can actually work decisions out with. And I think the closer you can help them get to the decision, the more valuable it ends up being. And so I think we'll see all sorts of things, you know, which will change this. Now, you know, there's a big question about how editorialization works in this. How does the curation of this knowledge work? And curation becomes quite complicated when you have curation of, in a sense, pieces of programs that are actually going to work on the data. You know, it's one thing sort of curating a dead article. It's another thing curating an article with interactive apps in it. That sort of becomes a different level of curation where you have to check different other things. It's a bit like software, you know, checking software when you're doing things. And so that is an area where I think we'll see much more value invested and something that people will really want. And we have seen that to some extent. The value that, for example, Apple do with applications in making sure that some of them work to some extent is pretty valuable compared to cases where that isn't done. And there are all sorts of questions about how much do you lock that down versus how little do you lock that down. You know, if you look at Android versus Apple, that's a good example of deciding the lockdown level. And you get pluses and minuses from those approaches. One thing is for sure, wherever the value chain, wherever the value is in the chain, the value of computational knowledge is much greater than dead information. I mean, that's going to, so if you've got knowledge assets, you want them to be ones from which you can compute directly because they will be much more valuable assets than the dead versions. Think of maps versus the data for sat-navs, for example, and I know that's getting opened much more now, but you know, it becomes much more valuable if you can compute directly from it. So I thought I would walk through what some of these knowledge assets are and who has them. One set of sort of knowledge assets is, in a sense, corporate information. You know, corporations between them have fantastic amounts of information. Now, the reality is, in most corporations, you can't do some of the queries you'd really like to do. You know, what was Chris's incentive 2 months ago for Italy? You know, if that was probably not right for this Chris, but anyway. You know, I'd like to just type that in and ask the query. I think it's hard to find an organization where you can do that. What you tend to get presented with is reports, endless reports, that you manually as the human have to go and look through. What's the result of that? The result of that is you don't bother half the time. You don't do a lot of the queries that you'd actually do to analyze the information that you've got. So you're missing a lot of tricks there. And there's a huge amount of information sitting in corporations that is amenable to this computational approach in all sorts of areas. So that's a very important area. Publicly funded R&D. You know, it amazes me that we still have scientific papers that look rather like they did when Newton was around and, you know, have the same sort of theory of how you present information. You kind of have a précis and then you kind of compress down this very narrow pipe the information to the reader. And the reader then has to kind of uncompress it and figure out what on earth you were talking about and what algorithms you ran to produce this information. You know, I think publicly funded R&D, we should sort of insist has computable data attached to it and, you know, appropriate computational algorithms that you can play with. So you can actually play with the results. You can try new experiments with the papers that are produced. That would unlock a huge value from some of that publicly funded R&D instead of it ending up in dead papers that only a few people look at. The way I think of this often is sort of the bandwidth of communication between reader, in a sense, if you want to call it reader, and the producer. You know, right now what we do is in the olden days, printing and things were expensive, so you needed to squash this bandwidth very small to, you know, to allow you to get the information from the producer to the reader. But the world's changed. We have this fantastic breadth of way to communicate through electronic systems. So what you need to do is use that full, so to speak, bandwidth of communication to get from the producer of the information to the reader and not try and squash it up so that the reader can somehow uncompress it at the other end. There's really no reason for that. Now, another thing that I alluded to a bit earlier was knowledge assets of our own. We're all carrying around huge amounts of knowledge in terms of with all the devices we have and increasingly with health devices in the future. And of course, people like Facebook use that, and that's a very valuable knowledge asset. But the question is how to make that sort of computable. And actually, don't have a live example here, but this is sort of an example of what we did a little bit with this, which is to pull an analysis system onto Facebook. So if you go in, if you have a Facebook thing and you go onto Wolfram Alpha, for example, and you type Facebook report, you can see all sorts of weird analysis of your friends and how they're distributed and what things you've done, how popular are your friends, and all sorts of things which you may or may not be interested in. But the point is there is a lot of data encoded just in that. And we shouldn't forget that each of us in the future will be, in ourselves, very valuable assets in terms of using that data and mashing it with generic data that's out there from governments and beyond. So let's move on to governments, who also have a huge amount of information locked up. And I want to talk in a little bit more detail about this. One thing I always find interesting is, as we speak, governments are still the biggest user of government data. So any improvement in using that information can, I think, improve the efficiency of governments quite dramatically. And I think governments, in most cases, will be the first to admit that, frankly, they're not that efficient at using their own data. You know, democratizing knowledge obviously means sort of open and usable, and so there's from a policy point of view, obviously, there's the objective of allowing this data we've all paid for collecting actually be used for our own enterprises. And, of course, usable increasingly, in my view, means computable in the kind of ways I've laid out. Now, what are some of the example kind of gainers from making government data fully computable? Well, I have to say, in the long run, the biggest gainer by miles will be health. And there are various aspects to the gain that can be got with health. But one of the ones I want to talk about was sort of actually working from the full gamut of data that exists. So here is, for the first time, actually, we were allowed to show this project we did for Abu Dhabi. And in fact, they have a company based in London that is working with this. This is an interesting document. So this document, in fact, has, from the survey they did of risks in Abu Dhabi, from a large survey of patients, the anonymized entire data of Abu Dhabi connected with their health. And you can actually ask questions of this data right here. So I can ask, you know, if I had systolic and diastolic, you know, blood pressure measurements, what does this do to my heart risk score, etc., etc. And this is not computing off some averaged version of this. This is actually computing off the real data from that population. So that's pretty interesting. This is the first time this has publicly been shown. And I think it's a rather interesting example of computing real results from, you know, personally for you. Now, the reason I particularly think this is interesting is because of diagnosis. I think one of the biggest problems in health systems around the world is the rate of successful diagnostics, and even what we mean by diagnosis. You know, traditionally what diagnosis meant is a doctor tries to figure out which bin your particular set of symptoms fits in terms of labeling it with a disease. And from that, the disease then has attached to it certain ways to treat it, which are standardized and generic for the most part. And then they tell you you've got to take this or that to treat your problems. This is pretty inefficient and is pretty open to massive error. And I know there have been many studies that rate the diagnostic success of doctors, you know, as sort of, you know, anywhere from 20 to 40%. This causes, you know, massive trouble for everyone, right? Because it's obviously bad if you're a patient. It's also bad in terms of costs, and it's also bad in terms of the way you might train doctors to be able to handle these things and how you're training them. So there's obviously a huge possibility in the future in having what one might call algorithmic sort of, you know, algorithmic diagnostics and algorithmic ways to assist doctors in the way of automating this both the diagnostic and treatment. What you really want to do is say, here's the set of symptoms I've got. Given my set of data, for me, what is the treatment I need for these symptoms? I mean, that's really where you'd like to get to. Whether it's called this particular disease or that disease is kind of a middle ground that you don't so much need to be in the ideal world. So, you know, sensor-based medicine is coming, and we will have a lot more data to play with. And we have great ways to go with improving that. There's also ways of mining the traditional data to get the sort of algorithmic treatment that we're talking about. Now, there are also other kinds of things you can do system-wide, like ask, which hospitals have the lowest infection rates relative to the number of patients. Right now, it's kind of hard to ask that question. Yes, you can get somebody to analyze it, but there are a lot of such questions you'd like to ask quickly to get to the bottom of what's really happening there. So that's one sort of example. Let's talk about social security. I think there are very good ways to deal with some of the fraud issues there by computing from the data that there is. And I think we're missing quite a few tricks in trying to understand how people have gamed the system. We're looking often at the ways which they have decided to use the data, which are the same ways we're looking at them. If you look at them from a different way by computing new results, new knowledge, you may well be able to achieve much better results. Even things simply like claimant computations. Obviously, it should be simple to figure out how much somebody is allowed to claim, but actually the parameters for that are often quite complicated, much as I believe the current government's trying to simplify it, and it's quite good to be able to just compute the result specifically for a person. Economic assessment, of course, very amenable to computation. Which cities had the most new businesses last year? Good question. How do we get that out of today's government data? Which city has the lowest crime rate relative to income per household? These are all good questions that are quite hard to ascertain. Similar sorts of things with educational assessment. With transport. How do I get to the 8 p.m. showing of Les Miserables? That's a good question. What's the most efficient way? Well, I can take a Boris bike, or I can go and take the tube, or I can walk. What are the combinations of those? What you want is an answer to those sorts of questions. And those are all things that are amenable to computing. I think it's worth just understanding some issues with sort of eras of, in a sense, quantification, as I call it. One of the problems that I think, sort of zooming out a bit with the modern world, is we have a lot of things that we like to quantify, and the things that we are easily able to quantify assume an importance beyond their ability to judge. This is a serious problem, I think, across many areas of life. So exams are one example of that, right? And you have a figure which tells you that for this one thing, that's the number. The fact that you did very well in lots of other things is sort of a hard, that's a case where people believe that one number is representing too much. There are many other walks of life where the number has got very simple. And the number's got simple because the end consumer isn't able to calculate from the data. We've got to give them a simple metric, because the only thing they can use is the simple metric, because they have no analytical ability at the consumer end. So, in a sense, this causes all sorts of problems. I think it makes the target culture somewhat worse, because it means that targets have to be very simple, as opposed to being hunks of data where different people can ask very different questions of those targets, which makes them easier to game. If the one target you need to meet is X, you're going to make sure you meet that, even if a lot of other stuff goes completely awry. If what you're handing over is a wodge of data, and the people who are analyzing this are saying, well, I might ask this question about it, or I might ask this question, or I might ask this question, or I might ask this question to analyze it, it makes it rather harder to set up the gaming for that than a traditional target. So I think there's an interesting discussion about how this future era can improve our use of quantification. In a sense, I think there has sort of been, and this is very simplistic, but 3 eras. There's sort of been a judgment era where there wasn't a lot of data around. People didn't really use numbers that much. They sort of just guessed. I mean, I'm broad strokes here, but you might say to some extent before, pre-Thatcher and things, there was a sort of era where there was a lot of guesswork and not that many numbers. Then we had an era of kind of numbers, but the numbers are very simplistic. And so you end up with, meeting a target that everybody knows makes no sense, in the sense that, the whole picture doesn't fit with that incentive and that target. What I'm hoping we can get to is what we might call sort of agile targets setup, where in a sense, you've got a hunk of data that allows you to query many different targets. And that makes I think, improves. It gets you the judgment. You, as the end consumer of the data, can apply your judgment, but with numbers, rather than applying your judgment without numbers, as kind of happened in that pre-targeting and sort of simplistic targeting era. So one of the things I'm suggesting here is that people should be working off computable data, not off metrics. You should be handing people, here's in a sense, the envelope of what I'm doing, whether it's managing something. You're not, here are 3 metrics. And I think that will improve a great deal how one can quantify things. So I suppose what I'm talking about, in a sense, is a new era of knowledge in which you, the end person, are, in a sense, the generator of the knowledge. I was trying to think of a good way to summarize that. But traditionally, we've had the generation of the knowledge closely aligned with the person who's providing the information. I think we can diverge that more and more so that in the end, the person consuming the knowledge is generating the specific knowledge they need. And I see this as a sort of part of a progress of, in a sense, expression that gets personal. So if you look at a lot of different things in life, they were things that had to be done by some kind of expert and not near the end consumer. So, word processing seems very obvious, but you had to have somebody else do it. You didn't do it yourself often. Graphics, the web, of course, is a massive area of this. And in fact, the web, in a sense, is 2 things. It's both personal fact-finding and personal distribution of information. You didn't need a publisher to do it. You could just do it yourself. Digital photography is a somewhat interesting one. You didn't need to send off your film to get it printed, at a professional. It just goes up there. It goes on your website, or you print it out on your printer. And I think knowledge, we're kind of ready for the same kind of personal knowledge generation. The generation of the knowledge gets personal from the core data. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about education. And I say this is sort of paradoxical, because all the way through I've been saying we need to make the computer easy so that you as the human can interact with the computer and you can use the information that's there, make it easy to use. So now I'm suggesting we as humans, there's sort of a gap in this thing, which is that we as humans need to get better at knowing how to work with this automation. And at the center of this, I believe, is maths education, which is fundamentally broken around the world. The problem with maths education is this, that maths in the outside world is not equal to calculating. It is a much broader problem-solving subject. In a sense, maths is the world's most successful system of problem-solving. And what's made maths so important in the world in the last few decades is the fact that computers now do calculating. And that means we apply maths and computation to vastly more things than we ever did before in all walks of life. But in education, we're not doing that. In education, we are insisting that everyone learns how to hand calculate all sorts of things they will never ever do after they leave education. And far from conceptually empowering people, this, in my view, is stripping the conceptual empowerment from people's problem solving and maths. And that in itself is forcing people not to be able to do some of the important data analysis that they need to be able to do with computers outside education. And so one of the things I've been pushing very hard with computer-based maths is to, around the world, try to reform maths education as a way of allowing people to access, both for data and for other ways of problem solving, the power of mathematics with a computer in the way that everyone in the outside world has been doing increasingly over the last decades. The key point, and this is a very quick summary of my position on it, I have a rather longer summary that anyone who's interested can watch, but the key nub of this is, which I think often is misunderstood, if you remove the computer from maths, you remove the context. Now that seems a strange thing to say, but the reason I say it is this. The reason that we apply maths in all these walks of life into these difficult problems where maths was never applied for hundreds of years before is because the computer liberated us from doing the calculating on that. If you remove the computer, it means that you're taking us back to how we used maths 100 years ago, which was we didn't apply it in most places. You could use it in a few cases where it really worked, like, motions of planets, where there happened to be a neat thing that worked. But it didn't work for much of these hairy data problems and biological problems and things where there's a lot of hair, basically, on the problem. And so if you remove the computer, you will end up removing the context. And so we end up with these simplistic problems in education that are far less conceptual than they ought to be for that level of at the educational level they're put. So far from dumbing down education by using a computer, we can kind of undumb the education if we use it correctly and put the real hairy context back in. And I think also make people much more excited in the kind of things that maths can do for them by solving real life problems that might be something to do with their life, rather than things that are disconnected. So I do think that changing education, in particular centered around maths and being able to program, are important parts of this jigsaw of allowing us to be empowered in data. So I said one thing I'm saying in general is we have a choice in education. What do we do when we have a new piece of automation? Do we sort of ignore it and start making everyone do things by hand? Or do we stand on that automation and go forward? And I'm saying that history shows us, and will show us again, that standing on the automation going further is by far the right way to go. It's rather nice that we announced a couple of weeks ago that Estonia is the first country that will be computer-based maths education, and we're working with them to build out a brand new course in probability and statistics to start with, and it will be very interesting to see how that plays. I hope here and other places we can move forward on some of those agendas too. So I thought I'd summarize. What are the top actions for a computable country? Computable country is the term I use to describe a country which has got itself so all its data is kind of in a form ready for computers to use in an automatic way. I think that there's a sort of government computable data layer to bridge government data's availability and make it accessible. That's very important. I think that just throwing the data out, it's a great start, and it's good that we've done it, but it isn't far enough, and it won't get the big results that we can have. So in a sense, I think of this as a sort of infrastructure issue. And there's a question of how much infrastructure gets centrally built out and how much do you leave to itself. I think we need to go further to make this data computable than we have. Government-funded entities. You know, we should insist, as I said, on computable reporting and data repository. We have a project, I know, to work on making a data repository that is, contains computable data for scientific information. That's very important. If we pay for it, we should insist that the stuff is computable that we get out. I think another interesting direction, you know, the US has started this a bit with a smart disclosure direction they're starting, is to require kind of computable disclosure. We're seeing this in finance a bit. Don't just require metrics, require the actual whole sort of gamut of information published in a computable form. And that seems a powerful way to get round some of these problems we've had with quantification before. And of course, the maths issue that I brought up. So I use this term, computational knowledge economy, to describe where I think a knowledge economy, so-called, one in which I think is a normal description of knowledge economy, where I suppose a good fraction of the income in the economy and the work in the economy is to do with knowledge. I think we need to move our economy to the next level. The high up on the value chain of knowledge is whether you can automate the working of that knowledge. And in a sense, that's where the countries at the top of the value chain will be what I will call computational knowledge economies rather than just knowledge economies. I actually think Britain is in a pretty good place on the starting grid. But, you know, you can be on the starting grid and not move off, or you can push forward. The open data movement here, which is, you know, obviously ahead of many countries, you know, we've done this, there's this work already starting on data.gov.uk, which I think all are good progress. And, you know, in the health dimension, I believe we have the largest single set of data of any country because of the NHS. So we have a great starting point there, potentially, to do things with. The other thing I would say in terms of education, you know, we have great latent skills in problem solving. I actually think Britain, when you look at, you know, PISA scores of maths and things, Britain could play on another playing field where it would do very well. And you know, on average, I think Britain is good at problem solving. We just need to give people the equipment to do that. And I think we'll prosper ahead of many other countries that seem to be doing better than us on that field. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is that on? Yeah, perfect. So, Conrad, thank you. Fascinating talk. I think I might insist that all of our future speakers do computable presentations. I'm a convert.
That's a good start.
We've got a little bit of time now, maybe a quarter of an hour or so, for some questions. So if people would like to ask, maybe what I'll do is take 3 at a time. And if you could tell us who you are, where you're from, and keep your questions super concise, that would help us. So the 2 gentlemen at the front.
So in biology, we have a human project I've been involved in. We used to say that it's kind of part of the 40-year project of organising biological data. So we've got raw data, and we've got APIs on top. We've built this sort of curated layer in between. That seems to be essential because raw data is just too messy. But nobody really wants to pay for this curation. It's expensive. We've got hundreds of curators around the world. It's a big problem funding that in the European Mathematics Institute, similarly in the US. Maybe you can do some of it via a wiki kind of, interacting with lots of people, crowdsourcing. But, I would like to do this for the whole economics data.
Yes.
But where's the money going to come from?
Okay, so hold that thought, and let's take another question from the gentleman behind.
I don't know whether you realize, but you had an incredible political statement in there. When you showed the 5 areas where you would like government information being used for personal purposes, the 5 fields you mentioned are the 5 they call linked up projects of this Movimento Cinque Stelle that got 25% of the vote in yesterday's elections in Italy. There were 2 other things which you didn't have there. One is, they want to have free high-speed Wi-Fi, and the other thing is they want sustainability of the collectivity of those purposes. Now, it's normally presented as a protest movement, but they've done a sample of the people of this sort of self-assembled group, because it was assembled by internet, not as a political movement. And they found out that mostly in the 30 to 40 age with a university degree. Now, was there an intentional political statement there, or is it just one of those coincidences which, the sort of internet society brings about?
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman in the blue scarf, I think, had his hand up.
Alan Patrick Broadside, we've done quite a lot of work with corporate data, and a lot of it is very, very unstructured, so the cost of getting it out is quite high. And then the other point I'd make is when you've got lots of databases, it's possible to cross-collate them, so privacy becomes a fairly large issue very quickly. So I think those 2 areas need addressing.
Okay, so some points there about curation of biological data, question about your politics and political motivation, and this point around privacy, corporate data, and structured and unstructured.
Look, in the end, this curation is somewhat expensive. My argument is, so we have the same problem, right? It's, in the end, the data that's out there, even people who think they have very nicely ordered data, it's usually a bit of a mess in terms of getting computers to really work from it with current technology. In the end, there's a certain amount of investment that I think is needed, but I think it's sort of one of these things where you need to get over a barrier of enough data being computable for it to be really useful. And it is a struggle at the moment. It's a little bit what I meant by this value chain of knowledge. People are not thinking right now that this is a place where they need to invest, because they're not used to this being a sort of place where you need to put money right now to get good results. It's just not been in the sort of psyche for producing data in the past. The data, the money before has been in collecting the data nicely and to writing nice reports with it. So this is a different point in the value chain of knowledge. How is this going to resolve itself? It's hard to know exactly. I'm perhaps not the right person to ask which political process will work best. But I think that it does need some central infrastructure governmental help to get some of these balls rolling. And I think it's relatively modest amounts of money compared to how much we spend on collecting a lot of this data, for example. It's a bit like in the early days with software. People bought computers, and they thought that they didn't need to spend any money on software. They just thought either it was free or it could just all be open and somehow it all work. It didn't really work that way. And in the end, the apple cart went the other way. And in fact, people spend even vast amounts on software versus the hardware, and perhaps that's moving back a bit. I feel like this will go the same way. And so I think, in the end, I think what we'll see is a few real successes from having computable data where, great decisions happened or great sets of decisions happened, and people say, oh my goodness, we should invest in doing this too. And I think then that will sort of push people forward to put this investment in that part of it. And, of course, the Human Genome Project and the things around it are great examples of where, in a sense, there was some infrastructure investment to cause that to happen. And we have a fantastic result, which is computable with the extra curation and so forth that's needed to achieve that. And indeed, you can call up a lot of that with Wolfram Alpha, I think.
Okay.
So to move on to the privacy issues, while I remember that. Just a very general point about this. I think with all new technologies, whether in warfare or in computers, you get you get progress where you get the offensive builds ahead of the defensive, and you kind of oscillate and iterate with these things. So I think we're in a phase right now where it's easier to attack data and muck up people's privacy and lose things than it is to defend against that. I think that will move around, partly as people get experience with... right now, one of the problems is society doesn't really have experience. If you put your car outside, you kind of have experience of you need to lock it and you need to do the various things and to make sure that the obvious burglar can't take it. People don't even know what data they're giving up when they use Facebook or whatever, or Google. And so without that kind of societal knowledge, it's hard for people to know what privacy they're giving up and how they can safeguard themselves. So that will build over time. I think people are already getting better on that. But we've got some way to go. So I think there are various pictures that will improve it. But then we'll have another leap in technology, and suddenly the apple cart will be upset again, and we'll go back the other way. So I think it's a sort of constant vigilance that's required. On the whole, I think the sort of scare stories about privacy loss tend to be worse than most of the actuality that's happened. But, I may be proved wrong soon.
Okay, some more questions. So we'll take the gentleman at the back in the white shirts.
Hello, Tom Rintoul, Serco. I was thinking about what you were saying about government data and about how you make that data computable. And it occurred to me that actually the way that our company and various other companies that work for the government are required to do things for the government, have done things for the government, is very, very well documented, but it's documented in contracts, which are barely human readable, let alone computer readable.
Yes.
Has any effort been made anywhere else, or by your people, to produce a computable contract?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. So two discrepant answers. We know of a couple of people who are involved in, as economic lawyers and things, who have indeed been trying to make that to happen, but I'm not sure they've succeeded yet. I think the area, I suppose, where in a sense this is happening, although I wouldn't quite term it that, is in finance. I think the risk assessment directions in finance are essentially, to some extent, from another direction, trying to make computable contracts or computable, in the sense that when you regulate the risk of a bank, it's like really what you want is here's the computable contract of what the bank's doing in a slightly different form that you're discussing. Yes, in a sense, that's exactly what I'm meaning by having this whole gamut of computable data that you hand over rather than metrics. And I think that that is the way that, in a way, contracts should be. And I think that, yes, I mean, many contracts, so the answer is I think there are some cases where academics and things have tried to make effectively computable contracts. I don't believe this has been implemented that I'm aware of anywhere yet. It is something that we've been actively asked about on several occasions. I'm not aware that we've yet started a project on that. But it's again, one of the problems, issues with privatizing things has always been that the weak link is the contract in a sense, right? I mean, the strong thing is hopefully the management of the thing that got privatized out. The weak link is the contract between government and the private sector, or inside even between private sectors. It would be, so a computable document where you actually see the outcomes in different cases does seem to improve that possibility a great deal, improve the likelihood of that not getting screwed up.
Okay. Let's take a few more in a group. So the gentleman at the front had his hand up.
Uri Grodzinski from Fluid. So before I ask my question, I'd just like to mention that patents are another area where things are barely readable for a reason, human readable. So they patents, yes, they write them so that
patents,
patents, yes, so that you can't understand
Yeah.
what's actually there.
Yeah. Indeed.
But as a scientist in training, when I see a piece of data, I always look for the source of it. And here with the computations, that's the way it is. So if the basic data that we rely on is not to be, it's nothing to be, I mean, it's something that is agreed by everyone, then that's no problem. But so, I don't know, maybe the number of sheep is a number and nobody can argue. But if you ask something about poverty, for example, you ask the government, you ask different organizations, you'd get different kinds of computation. So how do you...
Okay,
Okay, so hold on to that, and then the gentleman in the white shirts.
I guess two questions, really.
So tell us where you're from, sorry?
Sebastian Talens from the Cabinet Office,
Okay.
but I'm asking this more as a scientist.
Yep.
So the first one relates to what we've just been discussing here on, is a technical question, really, on how we can make these things that are barely human readable, machine readable. And there's a project you might want to be aware of called legislation.gov.uk. And that uses linked data. And I think that's the question I'm really getting to is, what are the various approaches of turning static data into stuff that is machine readable? Because obviously we have the linked data, which is essentially requires manual intervention, and then a more statistical approach that has been used by Google and others. And then my second question, or rather more of an observation, goes, it sounds like you really want everyone to become a scientist, which is something I thoroughly approve of. But this goes back to the issue that you just mentioned on metrics and where we have agreement on something. I thought it was rather interesting that you talked about the idea of a sort of more interactive academic paper. But it strikes me that there's something very important going on. It's not really the data that's important in an academic paper. It's the argument, it's the reasoning, it's the transparency behind the assumptions that go into it, how you make the measurements in the first place. And it strikes me that we would move then from arguing about, oh, have we met this target, have we met that target, has this criteria been reached, into arguing about what the criteria is about. What is appropriate criteria to be judging a situation by. And that I think is progress. But it's obviously something that would be a lot more complicated.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll take one last question. The gentleman at the front had his hand up. Second row.
The buffer may be getting full.
It's okay, I've got a note.
That's good.
It's human readable.
Lawrence Fowkes, the Armed Forces. I sort of got a sense from what you were saying, sort of a railing against unstructured data and the need for us, rather than things being produced so frequently in report form, that things were more in terms of knowledge fragments and things which could be tagged. Do you have an alternative thought to the Word document?
Maybe I can take the last one first and then work back through the others. I suppose I think you can optimize each. I think that it depends the way you work and what you want to do. The way I often work is, there are certain things I just want to know at that moment, where I would often Google them if I'm searching raw information, so to speak, where I think instead one can do this sort of linguistic querying. But I think there is a role for documents, narrative, but I think they should be computable. And in the end, in a sense, the data underlying both of those can be the same. It's computable information. which can drive both of those interfaces. So I suppose the way I look at it is, it's not so much that, I mean, there will still be fuzzier and fuzzier data out there that is harder to quantify. I think over time we'll get better at somehow allowing that to be queried in a computable way. But obviously the data that's very numerical is easier to do first, and is easier to apply these techniques I've talked about to first. So I sort of separate in my mind, there's the data itself and its computability. And there's the interface that one applies that, whether it's an app, linguistics, or a narrative. So I do think one wants reports still, in some circumstances. Absolutely, I think one wants that, because one wants somebody else to be leading one through what their analysis of the situation was. But I think then one wants to be able to drive. I often say, you know, it's a bit like, you want to be able to sort of drive, you know, in a sense, it's nice if you've got a four-wheel drive and you can drive over the landscape. What's not so good is if you're on a railway line and you just like, you can go forward and that's it, you're kind of stuck. So it's like, I think we want to turn the reports from railway lines into, you know, you rent a four-wheel drive. Let's go back to...
So the previous one was, do we all need to become scientists?
I think we all need to do the kinds of maths at a much higher level that at least what I call maths, problem solving, whatever you want to call it. I think that that is what maths education is aiming to do, but I think it's kind of, you know, there's a chasm that's opened up between it and the real world of problem solving. So I think, yes, I think to live in modern society, you need to be a lot more quantitative problem-solving ability than you did even 20 or 30 years ago. You know, to buy the right, you know, the standard example, to buy the right mortgage is actually pretty hard today. I remember we had a pension company that tried to screw us somehow, and I remember we gave them a computable document to explain why the amount they were trying to pay us back wasn't right. So they were surprised by that, right? And I think we got the money. You know, that's the kind of thing that, frankly, many more people should be able to do. And, you know, when you hear government statistics, right, what does it mean? You know, I mean, can people assess and understand in a sort of everyday life way, you know, your chance of getting swine flu? Should I vaccinate my children? These are real-world problems that are much harder now than they were some time ago. So I think in that sense, yes, everybody does. And then, of course, there are many technical jobs in the world which are often at the top of the, you know, the pay scale and things, and are very. And it's also interesting, I should point out, that many people running companies today are technical people. This was not true 30 years ago, right? I mean, you know, so many of the most valuable jobs in the world are technical. So there's obviously the technical job, and then there's also what I would just call being able to analyze your life in a good problem-solving way. So if you count that as being a scientist, you know, I think by the time, if you have sort of in a sense, if you feel maths in the way I'm talking about, you kind of get experience for what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. You know, if you're managing a bank, hopefully, then they tell you, we eliminated risk with maths. Right? Hopefully, you should, without being able to calculate anything, you should know, hang on just a moment, there's something wrong with that. I don't know exactly where the logic breaks down maybe immediately, but that doesn't seem to add up.
Okay, and the first question at the front was about the provenance of the data and the tension between computation and actually knowing what it is it's being driven off.
I think one of the crucial things, and we do this quite often, is you say, assuming, you know, UN data for countries, this is the answer. So you can have a sort of disambiguation layer where you allow people to choose potentially different data sets. And I think in the future, you could allow them to add their own data sets. And, you know, according to data set A, that was, you know, crowdsourced data set A, this was the answer. I think that's at least one approach for how to, I mean, and there are all sorts of problems with this. I mean, you know, talking about food and things, rather of the moment, you know, it's like if you're in, you know, parts of Asia, right, and you type dog in, right, that's a food more than a pet, right? So that's a different sort of, you know, you've got to kind of understand context quite a lot to be able to figure out what it is you're talking about. And perhaps the same might be more troublesome here with horse, I guess, at the moment. So.
Okay, look, we are coming up on time, so what I think I will do is wrap it up there. I'm sure that we could continue the conversation all evening, but I know people have got to get away. So, Conrad, it's been a tremendously interesting talk. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone for coming. If you want to revisit any of the talk, then it'll be up on our website as a video. If you want to carry on the conversation, then you can find us on Twitter or drop us an email, and we'd love to carry on talking with you. But for now, thank you very much, and Conrad, thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.